moment. So for those of you who don't know me, why have you dialed into this? So I'm Ken Marchingo, CEO of HavenHomeSafe, and joining me today for another one in our series of ad hoc occasional conversations is Stephen Anthony from Industry Superannuation Australia, where he's the chief economist. And I'll welcome Stephen more formally in a moment for you, but I'd like to kick off, as we always do, by acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Djadjurrung, the Djara people. And so I would like to acknowledge and extend my appreciation to the Djadjurrung people, to the traditional owners of the land that I'm standing on, or in this case, sitting on, I guess, that I and my family make our living on. I acknowledge all of the participants today will be on one country or another around this fine land, and these lands will also be the traditional lands of many nations and tribes, and we collectively acknowledge that. We pay our respects to leaders and elders, both past, present and emerging, for the memories that they hold, the traditions and the cultures that they hold, and in particular those of the Djadjurrung people. We express our gratitude in the sharing of this land that was never ceded, land that was never traded, never sold, never given away, but taken. We express our sorrow for the personal, spiritual and cultural costs of that, and our hope that we may always walk forwards together in a spirit of harmony and healing. And so with that acknowledgement of country, I would like to now acknowledge Stephen Anthony, who is, as I said before, the chief economist of Industry Super Australia. And he is, can I say, a darling of the affordable housing sector, and many others, because he brings a view representing Industry Superannuation Australia that might be a little bit different in some regards from what we traditionally hear, and we'll come to that a bit later. So Stephen's the chief economist and has over 20 years of experience in macroeconomics and fiscal policy. Previously to this, he was the director of budget and forecasting at an economic modelling firm called Macroeconomics. He's worked as a senior policy officer at both the Federal Treasury and Department of Finance in Canberra in fiscal and budget analysis. Being in the community sector, we love fiscal policy, but, you know, just saying. Earlier in his career, he worked briefly for the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the Heritage Foundation, and the Institute for International Economics, whilst undertaking studies in DC. He's a prominent economic forecaster. His name would be familiar to all of you. He contributes to the Reserve Bank of Australia's quarterly survey of market economists. He's a four-time winner of the Age Sydney Morning Herald BusinessDay Economic Survey in 2013, 2015, 2016 and 2018. Sort of pattern there, every 2 years he should be lining up for this year, one hopes. His research interests include examining the interaction between financial markets and the macroeconomy, or macroeconomy as it's properly said, and analysis of government budgets and spending programs. At Industry Super Australia, Stephen's economics unit has been developing a pioneering flow of funds macroeconomic model of the Australian economy, known appropriately as Matilda. It's intended to shed light on the risks associated with balance sheets in key institutional sectors such as households, banks, superannuation and the general government and so on. In other words, trying to shed some light on how the actual real economy works. Stephen is a member of the New South Wales Community Housing Industry Council, the China-Australia Financial Markets Working Group, and the Melbourne Economic Forum. And he holds a first-class honours degree in economics from La Trobe University in Melbourne, a master's in public policy from Georgetown University in Washington, DC, and a PhD in economics from La Trobe University. Clearly, he had to fill in his time somewhere. Stephen, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks for that very kind introduction. It's more than I deserve, I can tell you.
Not true at all. So, Stephen, I was hoping you might give us a bit of a rundown, a bit of an overview of how your career path has brought you into the orbit of social infrastructure and specifically affordable housing, because for the last few years, if you peek under any rock, if you look at any working group, someone's talking about you or you're actually there. So I'd just be interested in what your observations are about how you got here, and any observations you've got about the sort of the dimensions of both the problem and the opportunity here in Australia.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Look, the answer to that, in all honesty, is I am, a problem solver, and I get fascinated the more difficult the problem. And I also like those problems that are in the too hard basket. The lost causes, perhaps it has a little bearing on, your welcome to the country as well. It seems to me that these are the only fights or the only issues worth working on anyway. And so wherever I can, I allocate time to affordable housing. It's foundational. It's the basis of all infrastructure in Australia and our settlement here and our families here. And I happen to have a wonderful chairman, Greg Combay at Industry Super Australia, who supports that sort of big, generous, big-hearted view of Australia. And, our board support thinking about these issues and how we can push the envelope and get more done in our super system and across the Australian economy. So, I'm very much encouraged to take these issues as far as I can, offer assistance to those people who also, have the right spirit and, want to do more in this area.
Fantastic. Can I just say, as someone who's occasionally referred to as the patron saint of lost causes locally, I very, very, very much agree with that. These are the problems and the issues that actually are worth attention, because they are the things that almost by definition others skate over. It's really, I'd completely lost sight of what Greg Combay was doing, which is a fault in my own personal research, but so good to see that he's still active, having retired from a spectacular career in politics, I think. Stephen, I think, the average punter growing up in Australia, certainly of my vintage, and hopefully not too many vintages back beyond that, but most people's exposure to economists has really been the bank economists. They're the ones who get the sound bites on the telly and the interviews on the current affairs shows. Your Bill Evans and Saul Eslakes and Alan Oslers and Chris Richardson, who's gone on to head up Access Economics or whatever they're called these days. And that was pretty much it, I think, for most people growing up. But now there's different voices, and there's $7 trillion of cash floating around in superannuation funds, and suddenly the only gorilla in the room is no longer the banks. There are multiple gorillas in the room, if I can use that clumsy analogy. And so, as the industry superannuation economist, you have not only a different audience, I think, but you're a slightly different remit. And so I guess one of the questions for me is, as the spokesperson for industry super funds, do you think you have a different role to those economists, that represent the big banks primarily? And what's the pressure like that goes with that?
Well, thanks, Ken. It's a multi-part question, so I'll do my best with it. Part of my role is right down the middle. It's just bank economists it's just provide economic commentary, do so, in a non-partisan, independent way. Lots of things that I say get me into hot water with our stakeholders about different policy issues and perhaps even emphasis. The extent to which we look down these rabbit holes into causes where we can do some good. That is something that you would not normally associate with a person in my role. So I guess we've been trying to frame things a little as we go. But what's the sort of seed of the difference? I think it's, we have very much become we had to fight for a seat at the table for many years. This is the super sector and the industry super sector part of it, the not-for-profit part of it. And you know, as we've become bigger, and I guess our share of the sector has risen, and as the super sector itself has become a larger and larger part of the economy. Yes, it's currently it's about 130% of GDP, about 1.8 billion. Sorry, $1.8 trillion. So it's huge. Sorry, I'm going to correct that. GDP is basically about $2 trillion, and we're basically about $3 trillion. So, you know, we are about a half a times again bigger than the economy.
Wow.
So, you know, it's huge, and our funds represent about a third of that, and we represent about 6 or 7 million Australians. You know, so basically we are a path to, I guess, wealth and retirement living standards for many working Australians, for the vast majority, in fact. And we never forget who our members are and what it is that, you know, we're here to serve. And it's them. And we do that, I guess, by having an expansionary, long-term view of the opportunities that this country provides to us, and opportunities that are there offshore as well. And what we try to do is we try to investigate those, we try to better understand them, we try eventually to invest into them and to generate jobs and prosperity, productivity. And while we're at it, we never forget that, you know, what's in our interest is the national interest. So there's no sort of short-termism in our approach. And remembering that we are an equity investor, a long-term equity investor. So we have a long-term perspective. And where we get off the bus from the banks is we really don't like an economy that is highly leveraged. And we just see that as a risk. So we're very much about the stakeholder economy, the long-term equity-driven economy. No short-termism for us. We want governments to take a long-term perspective, no matter what their political stripes. And we want to help governments achieve their objectives by taking a seat at the table and you know, meeting their funding requirements for them, if we can.
Yeah, that's a really good analysis, and it really sort of steps it out for me. One of the things, of course, is that you might not have seen this, but from where I'm sitting in Bendigo, you froze on my screen for a while I got an error message saying that my internet was unstable. Now, given that I've purchased the highest level of broadband or NBN connection I can get, I'm just forced to recognise that the way that particular infrastructure was rolled out could have been done better. But anyway, there you go. So I didn't quite get all of that, but I think I got enough of it. And I think that's the key. And one of the things for non-government organisations is, you know, whilst we're involved with trying to resolve homelessness and housing one person at a time, and you know, at a surface level, you know, this is stuff that's very much in your face. But at the end of the day, we don't solve the problem generally unless we get different changes to long-term, long-range policy. And if we get a chance, I'd be keen to come back to what some of those long-range, long-term policy initiatives and opportunities might be. But one of the things that I guess that we are all inescapably involved in at the moment is that there's this virus running around. And I've been watching our Premier talk about getting back to a COVID normal world. I'm not sure there's anything normal about COVID, so I'm just going to refer to it as COVID permanent, I suspect. And so how has COVID permanent affected you and your industry, do you think, in terms of the new environment we're in? You know, do you think that if we've got COVID permanent for the foreseeable future, what sort of ways do you think that this might, you know, affect us just as citizens, and what might that mean for industry super? I mean, one imagines that we're heading into a period of low returns as a starting point, but just generally, what's your take on what this means?
Thanks, Ken. The comment that you make about low returns, I suspect we were moving into that period anyway, because we've had a period of very low productivity growth across the OECD, and yet we've had a decade after the GFC of pretty high returns, largely fueled by monetary policy. So that you would have thought that perhaps we're in for some lean times, and if you throw COVID on top, you would think that could be problematic. In terms of just how severe or just how deep those problems may be, I think we need to wait and see how this vaccine rolls out. That apparently is on stream for Christmas and in the new year. I think we need to see just how effective it is, just how often we need to use it to keep ourselves free of this issue. And I guess we have to look at the future course of the virus itself and whether it mutates. So I guess the worst case scenario is that there is far less international travel, that we have to be very careful about movements across borders, all borders, state borders as well as international borders, and that we have to be careful about concentration of people, population density, and moving people into the same space at the same time. That said, a lot of what we've learned about this thing is just good common sense, good hygiene, in public places, keeping activities outdoors, not indoors. And obviously this has some implications for asset pricing. But, the nice thing about asset prices is they can adjust. And then, if necessary, they may have to be transferred to new owners. But once those prices have adjusted, we can all move on. Some things will be worth more in this environment. That open space is now worth more. The dense space is worth less. So, there are winners and losers. What's important, though, is that we keep our families together, that, we move together as a community in response to the shock that we've faced. So we don't leave anyone behind, and then we find ways to re-engage with the productivity of our economy through the workplace and through good policy settings. We have to get to a point where we're not just supporting people in the deep freeze, that, to stay away from concentrated work patterns, but we need to find ways to get that productivity soaring again, even if that is with people working more remotely or in less dense working spaces or more decentralized workspaces. So, for example, we go back to a model where we make every regional centre a large employment centre, and we have less people crowding into the cities. I mean, personally, I think the Grattan Institute view of the world, where Melbourne is the hub and everything else are the spokes, is a very foolhardy view. Very unbalanced, very unsustainable model. It just leads to a sort of I guess what I would describe as a kind of an inner city elite sort of dictating to everybody else. And those people who are at the end of the line, they can just go, hey, personally, I despise that. It's so anathema to our sort of national, what the old Aussie fair go once was, and should be again. And hopefully, perhaps things like COVID remind us of that.
Yeah, it's a really good point that you make there about, because I don't think there's a hard-working non-elitist Australian alive who would suggest that the notion of a fair go and the social compact that that rolls around that has largely disappeared as we've watched more and more of the workforce shift to insecure jobs, to part-time jobs, the casualisation of the workforce, and even people who would ostensibly be permanent employees are on short-term contracts, and that lack of certainty, it plays out in households, it plays out at kitchen tables, it plays out in, people planning about how they're going to bring their family up, and so yeah, I for one would be very, very keen to see some balance come back into particularly industrial relations matters as far as employees go, because there is no doubt with the shift to contracting and a range of other things over the last 2 decades that that balance, that social compact, as I refer to it, has been largely torn up and thrown out the window. But going to your point about the productivity argument does the power stay in the CBD and radiate out and get weaker? The benefits get weaker as you radiate out further from the CBD. We had a conversation with Tim Williams, who's I was going to say famous, but I also use the word notorious, urban planner and transport guru from the UK, who now lives proudly in Australia. Great friend of mine, but Tim is a great believer that the primacy of the urban will and the CBD will continue nonetheless. But I can't imagine those thousands of people rolling back into Docklands anytime soon en masse between 7:30 and 9:30, and en masse leaving again, between 4:30 and 8:30, I guess. But those thousands of people who flood in and out of office towers in the CBD, and so that also, I think, brings into question the point that you made, that some things will be worth more, some things will be worth less, some things will be valued more and valued less. And so I wonder to the extent to which we might be looking at some repurposing of elements of our CBDs, if indeed this phenomena of working from home and perhaps moving to regional or suburban activity centres continues. So in terms of just that notion of repurposing of buildings in CBDs, assuming there is no vaccine, or the vaccine is perhaps less efficacious than we might hope, what do you think that would do to the economy broadly if there was that sort of flight from the CBD?
Well, it's obviously a valuation issue for the existing asset owners, and as we said, there'll be winners and losers along that path, including perhaps some people, some investors that get to pick up distressed assets along the way, and depending on who the current owners are, and remember that a lot of the owners are foreigners. Whether it's a net loss for the Australian people is an interesting question. Obviously, our super funds hold a lot of commercial property and hold a lot of infrastructure assets. A lot of things that have taken a hit in the short term. But personally, a lot of what we're talking about, you would consider blue chip assets. And so, look, you take a hit in year T plus one, but you don't feel it if you're valuing out into, year TN, it's just a hiccup. And quite frankly, other than the realization or the reminder about what's really important in life that comes through this whole pandemic, I'm wondering if most of that stuff sort of washes out through asset prices relatively quickly through time, and then we just get on with perhaps less dense workplaces and more decentralized working. And all of that is a good thing. It will encourage more technological uptake around the home, and more flexible working arrangements, more working arrangements that let you know, the second worker in the household, often that person that often feels, you know, often gets left to do most of the caring, it gives them more of a chance to participate in the workforce, and of course that's a good thing. So you know.
Yeah, so that could take me down a whole new avenue, because so much of this conversation about the impact of COVID has been about you know, those in insecure work and casual work, and often informal work, who've really been hit very, very hard. And of course, the vast majority of those people are female. So, you know, it's been talked about as a sort of almost a gender-based recession for so many. But we would run out of time if we went down that line. So one of the things that has interested me is the shift to the sort of ESG framework. So, you know, investors around the world, and I guess much of this would also apply to industry super, have not been looking not just at the financial return of their investments, but progressively moving to environmental, social, and governance kind of considerations about the impact of their investments. And I think we've seen that with the recent bond raising from NIFIC, where some of the super funds, some of the industry super funds have started to take small bites by buying into those bond raisings. And so that holistic investment approach has, I guess, really had some impact recently in Australia, when we saw what Rio Tinto did with their desecration of some known previously protected sites. And we saw some shareholder activism essentially by some of the big super funds. And, you know, I think the impact of that was quite sharp and quite powerful for Rio. But do you think, have we awakened a beast with our super funds as a result of that? Do you think we'll see more of that? And is that a good thing, do you think?
Oh, well, absolutely, it is a good thing, Ken. And obviously, it's a responsibility that, you know, it's an ability or a privilege that must be exercised responsibly, you know. So none of us are the arbiters of all right and wrong. None of us know the future path of technologies, you know, so we need to be very careful that, you know, we don't lock in a sort of a group think which imposes future costs for generations that are not yet born, you know, because we couldn't think outside the square, you know. But that said, in the context of Rio type activity, and by the way, Rio should be an Australian company with Australian directors. How that ever was allowed to occur is just beyond me, given that they're exploiting rents on Australian land. And that whole episode is just a disgrace. You know, something has to be done about that. They must pay a permanent price for that. That is our national heritage there. And it must, I mean, it must be even much more galling for Indigenous Australians. I mean, it just beggars belief. I hope, you know, I just remind our federal politicians, you know, if the message is getting through, that this is a very, very sore point for so many Australians, of all sorts of political stripes. And, you know, to think that this foreign company could do that and do it quite knowingly, apparently, just disgraceful.
Yeah.
Anyway, I better move off that, Ken. It's obviously a bit of a sore point.
Well, I think we're probably all of exactly the same view on that. and there are still many examples, even yesterday in Victoria, where a sacred tree that was supposed to be protected as part of a freeway was cut down. Just shocking business.
Yeah.
And you wonder how far we've come sometimes. But anyway, the back on track, I guess. So I guess one of the things that then leaps out at me, and I'm sure I'm not the only one or the first to work this out, and in fact I may well be last to the party, as it turns out, is that we've been in a low rate, low return environment for a little while. We've got the lowest interest rates in living memory, and likely to stay that way for some time. We're now starting to see these ESG principles not just being boutique responses, but now starting to form part of the decision making of very, very large investors like industry super funds. And so I see all that, I hear all that, and I just have to think to myself, they're talking about social and affordable housing here. I mean, it's doing social good. It's covering a hole in the marketplace. You know, if Mr. Smith and his Wealth of Nations made the point that for capitalism to work, it should, you know, be based on his precursor work, which I think was called the theory of moral sentiments, which basically said, you know, there's a role for government when markets fail, and we've got a responsibility to those who fail in the marketplace. Surely, does this mean our time has come, do you think, for affordable and social housing to begin to tap into investments broadly from, you know, local or international superannuation funds who are looking for long-term investments with small but stable returns?
Yes. So yesterday, a number of people from the affordable sector were meeting with the, National COVID Council to talk about affordable housing, and we're trying to make this case. The answer to this is we've spent 3 decades driving the demand side of the housing market, largely through Commonwealth policy, you know, fiscal policy, through tax expenditures, negative gearing, capital gains tax exemption, and others, you know, through the way we set up super, through leverage, you know, but also through monetary policy, you know, allowing monetary policy essentially to operate through wealth transmission mechanisms rather than a more sort of stable path. Now that, of course, it's priced people out of the market. It's driven up the demand for affordable housing, and we haven't ever seen the wisdom of addressing the issue from the supply side, which means reallocating the resources that governments are currently spending on the demand side into the supply side and targeting at the sub-market level, you know, those people who are most needy. And of course, that's those people who are essentially living in social housing, you know, essentially receiving a benefit from government and just doing their best, just really scraping by, you know. So that's the long answer. That's what we need to do. Anybody who argues with the wisdom of that approach, I think, is playing a political game where they want to, you know, pass the buck from one level of government to another, and isn't a friend of policy reform in this area. I think that, putting humility aside, I think that's a fair statement of what the problem is. And if people don't want to get on board, they're playing games to stop this issue advancing, you know. Now, obviously, you know, we've got to bring people along with us for the ride, but I think it's becoming increasingly obvious that so many more people are locked out of the market and are really doing it tough, especially older Australians now. Lots of women, you know, in sort of tragic circumstances, getting older, homeless, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So here is the time for the super funds to step up and it seems that's what's happening. So, we've seen some real leadership from, Equip Super and I think from Cbus and many others, especially in the key worker space, but doing their best to think about models that could help right through all the deciles of the problem here, thinking about the entire population. Is there enough being done? Well, we'd certainly like to be doing more. We're certainly, I guess, getting our knees grazed, fighting the good fight with government, making the argument about what the right approach is. And basically, we're saying to government, we can meet you halfway, but you have to make up the funding gap that the provision of this housing will require. We don't want any special promises. We don't want any sort of free lunch, but you just have to make up some of the gap that exists now between what you would achieve in terms of a commercial return, which is what our members expect, and what you can achieve from perhaps those social housing developments, salt and peppered into mainstream housing, So we're doing our best. We're making the argument. There's all sorts of political games being played in the space, but we'll keep at it. And as you know, Ken, with lost causes, you just keep plugging away, and eventually there'll be a visionary political leader, a Whitlam or a Keating, a Chifley. There's somebody out there, probably female, probably Indian, somebody out there with a big heart and a big brain who we can work with to get this done.
Well, I'm just reminded that I think there's a Curtin, a Chifley and a Keating book on my bookcase behind me, and I didn't need a Whitlam book because I reckon I memorised everything he ever said. Yeah, look, I mean, well, I guess we all wait for the visionary leader, and but in the meantime, I guess as you say, with lost causes, you keep plugging away. So what sorts of things do you think housing associations can do? I mean, I've been talking to one of the super funds about the intersection between build to rent and social and affordable housing, and you would know, and you've made this case quite well in recent and past articles, that the treatment of the build to rent, for example, doesn't get the same sort of treatment as say student housing, and if you flip it and sell it, you get some benefits straight away, but if you try and hold it, you can be up for a sort of a 30% tax, and so there's a lot of disincentives for the build to rent market. But it seems to me that the future of well, if I step back, successful neighbourhoods have always been replete with a variety of people of both income demographics and different cultural styles. And where they work well together, you get well-functioning neighbourhoods. In denser populations, they tend to be not laid out flat, but go up high in apartment buildings. But the more you mix tenure, the more you mix income demographics, the more diverse community you tend to get, and the more forgiving and responsible community I think you tend to get. The sociologists would have better words to describe that than me. But the question for me, I guess, is if you can mix, as you said, salt and pepper affordable housing through other residential developments in mixed tenures, it would seem to me that there should be natural partners between build-to-rent investors and housing associations, especially given that housing associations can manage those build-to-rent developments as well. We have all the skill sets to do that. And so in order for that to happen, we need to somehow match up housing associations at scale, or perhaps consortia of housing associations to get scale with potential investors. But where should that conversation start, do you think? I mean, how do you progress that conversation at a national level in the absence of, shall we say, a progressive desire to do it at a federal level?
Someone has to play the role of a market maker, So somebody with sophisticated financial understanding has to step in and be a fair broker in the middle of this and say, let's make a deal, all right? You know, you want more housing, you want to supply the capital, I'll make a market for you. Now, that could be a state government, that could be a federal government, you know, through their financing arm, or, you know, that could be a large financial institution, very large, I think, in the context of what's required here. What we need is basically 20, I think we need to be ambitious. I think we need at least 20,000 social houses built every year across the nation, at least that. Now, the sort of numbers that are required, you know, I think you can do your maths, and it's certainly achievable in the context of, you know, the federal, the sort of the federal budget at about $500 billion. It's eminently doable, especially where most of the cost of the provision of that housing is carried through the private sector. It's just, at the moment, there's no willingness on the part of any level of government to play that role of market maker. They have to make a market. They have to have a financial, they have to establish a financial institution that can carry the market, that can create that market, support it institutionally, and backstop it if things are going wrong. Now, the question is, when will that happen? I suspect it happens as soon as the need becomes more apparent, and that could be within 18 months.
Wow. Well, let's hope so. I'm hoping that there will be such a thing. I mean, we had high hopes for NIFIC, and I think what NIFIC has done within their remit has been outstanding. And I think there's a strong desire to continue to capitalise NIFIC and lift their cap so that they can continue to lend. But as you say, and as you said earlier, you know, there's what we refer to as the subsidy piece at the end. You know, we could all go out and borrow money till the cows come home, but if you're going to rent subsidised housing to people that is, you know, non-market rental housing, there's a thing that you need for subsidised housing. You need a subsidy. You know, that's the issue. And so, you know, if indeed some of the demand side stuff, as you said, could be turned around to the supply side, what a difference that would make. I often wonder to myself if Brian Howe, you know, the legendary former Deputy Prime Minister, has ever wondered whether he should actually have introduced CRA, which is money that's gone shoots straight through to the landlord's pocket, which then usually shoots straight through to the bank, which usually shoots straight through to the shareholder of the bank. I often wonder if Brian Howe occasionally lies awake at night and thinks to himself, I wonder if we just should have built more social housing with that money. But anyway, I'll leave that for Brian. But, you know, a giant still, I might add. One of the questions, I guess, that I was slightly interested in, I'm conscious we're going to run out of time, unfortunately, but and this is probably a $64,000 question, because you can't pick up a newspaper. You haven't been able to pick up a newspaper or a magazine article in Australia for probably the last 3 decades that hasn't been talking about housing markets. Now, of course, it's all been talking about rising housing markets, and then along came March, and everything's kind of leveled off. We have had some levelling off in the last couple of years, I think since 2017. But can we finish up on, you know, economists are renowned for steering into their crystal ball and for foretelling the future. My understanding is that your crystal ball probably looks like massive amounts of mathematical models and spreadsheets and research. But what do you think is going to happen in the housing markets, in sort of your capitals, your suburbans and your regionals over the next couple of years? Because as a housing association CEO, we've got to go out and get some stuff.
Yeah, look, I think you'd split Australia up by regions. You would think that Sydney and Melbourne have got a problem, and by definition, I think satellites of those perhaps may see some downward adjustment as well, just because they were driven so heavily by overseas temporary visa holders and so on, and also international cities, and quite frankly, the banks have been pushing an unsustainable amount of debt onto households for reasons that don't have a lot to do with financial stability. So, you would think that there's an adjustment that's going to occur there, and we don't wish that on anyone, especially anyone who's borrowed recently, but that would be the observation. I think for the rest of the country, I think a lot of the pain that they have suffered through housing prices is probably behind them now, and that there is some blue sky, especially WA, and you'd think South Australia as well. So, potentially the people who may be hardest hit are those regions that have benefited the most over the last decade or so.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think it was Christopher Joy whose column in the Fin Review every weekend of recent times has been suggesting, well, all the people who suggested that the housing market would crash, would lose a third or more, were obviously reading their tea leaves the wrong way, and he's been a bit contrarian in saying, actually, I don't think there's going to be major, massive moves, generally speaking. And I think his last column, he was talking about, the return of expat Australians would almost balance out some of the visa holders who've left. So I guess, this is anybody's guess in a sense of where all this lands. I'm just kind of comfortable that Bendigo's far enough away that we've never really had those massive growths on the charts that some of our closer regional cousins may have had. But regardless, we still think of it as the centre of the housing universe, Stephen, and hopefully it'll long stay that way.
Well, it's a beautiful place. Yeah.
Yeah, well, of course, naturally. So, Stephen, I just want to, because our time is up, I just wanted to thank you for your time this afternoon in taking the time out of what is a ridiculously busy day, I'm sure, to spend some time talking to us. But I also wanted to acknowledge, thank you for coming and speaking at our last annual stakeholders meeting, which was really well received, and being a friend of HavenHomeSafe too, by making time available for us. And I look forward to catching up sometime when catch-ups are easier to do than they are right now.
Yeah. Ken, thanks so much for the opportunity today, but also you are one of the good guys of Australian public policy. Please keep it up and keep fighting the good fight. We really appreciate that you do what you do, and you're out there doing the Lord's work, as they say.
That'll be the only time I've ever been accused of that. Thanks, Stephen. See ya.